the Forged and Unbroken podcast.
Hey everyone, thanks for joining in on today's episode of the Forged and Unbroken Fire podcast. For this next little series, I'm actually doing a three-parter on what I'm calling Safety is Scary. And we're going to be discussing theory, mindset, research, and different ways to combat safety culture, but also risk aversion. And these three parts are going to be broken down into like what is safety culture, my opinions on it, giving it some examples, what is risk aversion, because I believe that's a major component to how safety culture has developed. And then also on the back end, how do we develop the grit necessary to lean into these high risk environments? So this is something I've been working on for a little while, but it's also constantly in the works. I'm always pulling in different things. So I'm just going to be throwing up some cliff notes. It's going to be some shorter episodes, but it's just probably a different take on some of the things that we've heard out there. So this first part, safety culture, I'm going to start with a quote, and it is, "Safety does not exist in nature, so why then do we seek it?" And that's a quote from Chase Jarvis. If, as you opened up this podcast episode, you probably heard the audio of tutus going on this scene. We have people trapped and they're banging on the windows. This was from a fire that I was on in the early 2000s where crews rescued a mom and her daughter. And if you're part of the Patreon community, I'll actually upload the video so you have some context. This was just old, for lack of better words, dash cam. I think it was like just an old digital camera that we had mounted to the front of one of the wagons. And you get to see the house when you pull up. The whole front of the house is just completely off. First engine pulls up on scene. They go straight to rescue mode. They're there with a ladder truck, so everybody's starting to put in rescue efforts. The second engine completes the water supply. They pull a 2.5-inch hand line. They're knocking down fire, and they actually even try to make entry, but the steps are all burnt away. They can't do anything. When you look at the video, it looks like it's just an untenable situation. I arrived there with my crew on the third engine. I was a firefighter. We go around to the backside, and ladders were already thrown for us. And one crew, the first engine, was already up on the second floor. They VES'd on the side Charlie, second floor. My officer goes in. We pulled it at a tack line to the back just to make sure we had some type of hose line in place because we weren't exactly sure what we were going to find when we went to the backside. Backside was relatively clear. My officer went up the ladder, went in. We actually talked about this briefly on an earlier podcast. If you want to go back and reference that, that's the podcast with Dave Olson. And he enters the room, doesn't find anybody. He makes a decision to exit the room and go down the hallway to the next room. I remember thinking, like, he's looking back, he's not actually sure if he should have done that because the fire conditions were pretty advanced. So he ends up making it to the other room. He meets up with the other engine up on the second floor, probably quadrant 2. They go into a bathroom, and that's where they find the mom and the daughter unconscious. I finished deploying the hand line. I start masking up, and that's when I see Engine 22's crew start taking out the window and say, "Hey, we got him here." So instead of me VESing, me and the backup firefighter go up the ladder to start bringing him down. So we bring the mom down. I just kind of assist with that because she's full-grown adult unconscious, just assisting with that. And then they bring him out to the waiting paramedics. I go back up the ladder, and Otter hands me, Dave, nickname Otter, he hands me the little girl, unconscious. I bring her down. One of the firefighters I was with starts just giving some rescue breaths, get them off to the awaiting paramedics. They end up saving both the mom and her daughter. And when you look at this video, like I said, I'll upload it to the Patreon community. It's just a quick snapshot, but you're like, man, that doesn't look tenable. But because there were crews there that leaned into the firefight, leaned into the rescue, they made it happen, and they saved a mom and her daughter, and they're alive today. Let's look at some of the history of safety. We throw that word around a lot, but what does it actually mean? In 1380, the first known written use of the word safety was in a novel by some French guy named Fierambras or Fierras. There's kind of some alternate spellings there, and the intention of the word was meant to be uninjured, to keep whole, or to be well kept. Now, the modern day definition of that has kind of evolved into the condition of being protected from or unlikely to cause danger, risk, or injury. In later years, like 1700s, we start seeing things like safety belts and safety valves. But it has its roots in the medieval Latin and later French. So I just find it interesting that even the modern day take of the word still uses things like unlikely. And basically what I'm trying to emphasize here is that, yes, there is this element of safety, but we need to realize that it is not a guaranteed thing. Now, I continue on. I'll upload these pictures also to Patreon. And we just talked about this fire with my buddy Steve Schultz, so you can reflect back on that. But the cliff notes on that one were, when you look at these pictures, there's fire on both levels of an apartment building, kind of a garden apartment setup. Entry points, all the windows, fire's just mowing through this thing. And you got crews that are trying to make entry into it and try to knock down this fire. Steve and Mark Plummer, long story short, end up going in, pushing past. They make a couple of attempts, and they rescue 2 adults who end up living. Now, when you look at these pictures, though, a lot of people say, like, nah, it's completely untenable. You just don't know. It's in that specific part of the building. So, again, I'm just using this as kind of some thought provocation of, are you going to search? Are you going to go in? Because there's plenty of people who just look at pictures and videos and snapshots, which to some degree is what we get on the fire ground. You pull up and you're just getting a quick snapshot of what's happening before you do 360s, before you can actually occupy the space and figure out what's going on inside of them. And people make assumptions. And a lot of this is based on training and experience and past calls. But if you don't have a deep bank there are going to be plenty of people who will look at these pictures or look at these snapshots like, yeah, no, we're not doing anything in there. So I just throw these couple of examples out there to just maybe push back on some of that. Like, yes, there are absolutely places that are going to be untenable and that we can't go into, but that's not going to be all the time. Now, excuse me, there's safety through policy. So if we keep splitting out what is safety, there's different organizations that affect what we do. We have OSHA, we have NFPA, your own department, general orders, and SOPs. So when we look at OSHA, in OSHA's policy, they quote, to assure America's workers have a safe and healthful working conditions free from unlawful retaliation. Okay, they're a governing body, they're a government agency, I get it. NFPA, they say we prevent and minimize harm from hazards like fire and electrical systems, focusing and minimizing risk to people, property, and the environment. And then this is taken from one of my own general orders from my department regarding safety. It is the responsibility of all personnel to act and operate in a safe manner during all activities associated with the Department of Fire and Rescue Services. So there's also mission and vision statements. OSHA talks about how they want to carry on their mission. They want to enforce standards. They want to provide training and outreach, education, research, assistance. And they talk about how they're going to support local and state programs. There's a lot going on. There's the mission is wide and varied between OSHA and NFPA. But just about any industry, we all have to interface with all these different policies. We need to be up to speed on training and regulations, and there's a lot going on there. But remember, safety means to keep uninjured. and they use the words like unlikely to cause danger, risk, and injury. So to fight fire safely, it's kind of a bit of an oxymoron. You know, even in NFPA, it's talking about minimizing it. It doesn't say completely remove. So with that, compliance does not mean no danger. So fighting fire safely is an oxymoron. So when I'm looking up like how departments and these governing bodies are talking about safety, they use words like unlikely, minimize, uninjured, prevent, mitigate, comply. So we have these literal terms, but we also have to interface with these value-facing terms. So to be compliant with OSHA or some department policy, this doesn't mean that there is no risk or that you will be uninjured. Compliance does not mean no danger. So in our line of work, the policy, procedure, training, they all lend themselves to reducing risk in an effort to keep us safe, and they provide direction and objectives to be met. But that in and of itself doesn't necessarily reduce or entirely mitigate unsafe practices, because the human dynamic is always going to be at play, especially when we're operating in nature, and that's an unknown and rapidly evolving environment. And as we said before, nature never adjusts to the level of skill of the personnel on scene. And it begs the question, if we come home victorious, does that mean that we have played it safe? Or by operating safely, does it guarantee that we come home victorious from the fire ground? So the parameters for fire department success are wide and varied and nuanced. Yeah, maybe we didn't save the entire house, but we stopped exposures from spreading. Maybe we saved heirlooms for a family. But we break this down even further. Do we enter an active shooter scene to retrieve and patch up wounded? Do we wait for scene safety to complete? For scene safety to be completed with more police officers and everything else before we go in? Do we search ahead of a hose line to rescue a trapped civilian, or do we wait for fire attack and water supply, and do we waste those precious minutes? Do we drop a firefighter off of a rope, off of a rooftop to rescue trapped civilians hanging out of a window? These are all game time decisions that we face, and depending on which way we take it, it's going to have very different outcome. Now, a couple more examples of some risk aversion and safety out in the field where it's turned negative. You look at Uvalde, Texas. There was almost 19 police officers inside of a school in the hallway. 911 communications received calls for 45 minutes while officers were inside during an active school shooting incident. Now, the police chief believed that the shooter was barricaded and was not actually an active shooter. So he ordered his crews to just remain in the hallway. Police officers actually had to push back parents trying to get in. And one off-duty officer was held back trying to save his wife, who ultimately died. And I remember that police officer ended up passing away in the weeks afterwards. And the doctors literally said it was from a broken heart. Now, a Texas DPS spokesman, Chris Olivares, said that if law enforcement proceeded any further, not knowing where the suspect was at, they could have been shot, they could have been killed, and that gunman would have had an opportunity to kill other people inside that school. I just find that incredibly interesting, because that is the essence, that is the spirit and the mission of a police department, is to proceed in, not knowing where the danger is necessarily going to be at, so you can neutralize that. Texas DPS said that the shooter could have been killed within 3 minutes, but instead it took 45 minutes, and it was one of the deadliest school shootings in the nation. Now we're going to pivot to Loretta Pickard, and she was quoted as saying, "They know I'm in here, right?" And this is the Polk County. And again, this is not, I want to be very clear, I'm giving cliff notes and outlines here of some of the things that I found online through government agencies and after action reports and things like that. I don't mean this in any negative ill will, but I'm trying to hold things accountable and use this example as things that we can learn from as best as I can in the most respectful way that I can. Now, with Loretta Pickard, she was trapped in a house fire. She was an elderly woman in her late 70s. She was pretty much non-ambulatory. She used the assistance of a walker. When crews got on scene, they had trouble establishing a water supply and actually gaining access because of power lines down. But they did ultimately establish a water supply. The power ended up getting shut off to the down power lines. And the elderly civilian, Loretta Pickard, was still on the phone asking to be rescued even after this was going on. The captain, the original command structure, also said that he didn't have a working computer, so I guess he wasn't seeing the comments coming in. However, it was still being radioed over the radio. And I think there was some discrepancies on what the dispatch center actually got out on the radio to responding crews, and the captain radioed that there were no residents on scene at this time. There are no cars in the driveway. There are no residents. So he's just basing the information on just a snapshot of what's happening on the exterior. However, 2 minutes after arrival, command came back and said there's 50% involvement and there is confirmed entrapment. So they are on scene for 2 minutes. That means, the way I read that is there's still 50% of the house that you can gain access to, and you knew that somebody was trapped inside. While this was going on, the captain sent a Snapchat of the fire while the civilian was still inside. He ended up getting suspended for 24 hours for breach of social media policy, and I believe the department ended up settling for $200,000 to the family. But let me be clear about this. After fire department arrival, Loretta Pickard was on the phone asking for help for 5 minutes after they arrived. And they were on the phone with Loretta Pickard, dispatch was, for 20 minutes in total. So again, it just seems like, I don't know if I want to throw the word out negligence, but there is this duty to act, right? We know people are inside and we didn't act. And ultimately, Loretta Pickard lost her life. Now, in doing some of this research, I found this document. It's called the Public Duty Doctrine. And a lot of attorneys sum it up as a duty to all is a duty to no one. So a fire department's job is to protect the whole community, not to guarantee the safety of any one individual. And there have been some court cases out there, maybe more specifically for law enforcement, but there's not necessarily a duty to act or to enter a space to save any one person. And I understand where it's kind of coming from. Like the public duty doctrine exists because if it's taken to an extreme, governments could become a de facto insurance provider to anyone who is injured. Or all someone would need to do is to allege that the government had a legal duty to prevent some sort of harm, and they didn't do enough to prevent the harm from occurring. On the fire service side, I believe Kurt Verone from Fire Law Blog talks about how, well, we only had a 100-foot ladder. We couldn't reach them. If we had a 105-foot ladder, then they would have been saved. Like we can always move the bar to incorporate more things that we could have done. So where does that bar actually stop? But the public duty doctrine holds that the government does not have a legal duty to act or render aid in the same way a parent or a doctor or a lifeguard would. Government does not have a legally enforceable duty to protect the general public from harm. So again, a duty to all is a duty to no one. We are there to protect the whole community, not to guarantee the safety of any one individual. Now, I want to be clear. I'm just explaining what some of the law is that is out there. I'm not saying I agree with it. So that leads me to, how do we operate? And I believe that we have this morality in decision making. So John Locke says, in his quote, is saying, when earthly justice fails, an appeal to heaven remains. And for any of you that are familiar with some of the original battle flags, I believe it was Massachusetts, there's the pine tree where it has the appeal to heaven flag. It was originally flown by Washington's Crusaders way back in the day when they were fighting the British. It's basically used to highlight a morality in decision making. So humans may inherently mess up law, right? We try to do the best that we can. We try to implement laws and regulations. This is my modern day take on this. And we just can't encompass and encircle every single thing that may happen to us. So I want to know, though, how you are going to sleep at night. What principles are you going to stand for yourself, regardless of the pushback that you are going to receive? And that is that morality and decision making, because things may happen that there is a higher moral ground that will break a rule But for you to sleep well at night, excuse me, for you to affect change, for you to save somebody, you may have to break that rule. And that's a decision that we're all going to have to make. It's not something that you can throw around loosely. It's not something that you can be doing all the time. You can't be an antagonist. And I would highly recommend that you know the rules, so you know when to break them. You need to be educated in what your policies are saying. But I do believe there is this element of morality in decision making. Now, when those things happen, sometimes we say, oh, we have cowboys. We're getting too aggressive. And I'm trying to figure out, like, well, why do we demean this aggressiveness culture? And I do believe that there's this brutally thin line between medal day and internal affairs. And what I mean by that is when we make these decisions on the fire ground to lean into the fight, that may put us in a trick bag. Yeah, maybe a firefighter will get hurt. Maybe we entered and the civilian still ended up passing away. Maybe you broke policy to be able to do that. We talk about Danny Dwyer down south who broke policy to go rescue somebody. So by one decision that you make, if it comes out successful, not that it's saying it's about doing it for the medals, but maybe you'll be lauded as somebody who leaned into the fight and it had a successful outcome. Maybe it doesn't have a successful outcome, or maybe you did break a rule and now you have to deal with your version of internal affairs. So I think that's a lot of why people will make these decisions like, nah, hey, it's not worth the internal affairs investigation. So that's a pretty heavy thing to be weighing on our minds in public safety. But I want to be clear, though, aggressiveness is not passiveness. It's not being defensiveness. You have to remain calm in really crazy situations. Aggressiveness is also not haste. I believe haste is inaccuracy. It's moving too quickly. It's not being calculated. It's also not laziness. This is somebody who has to lean into the fight. So we can't be reckless. We can't be a danger to the organization and your crews. But if you can make a difference, that should be your first priority, and safety may not always be there. So setting up this next little piece, Fyodor Dostoevsky, he was a Russian philosopher, novelist, and essayist. He was arrested for his political stances, stereotypical Russia politics. He was sent to a Serbian prison camp by the Russian government. He was the author of Crime and Punishment, just to kind of bring things full circle. He was actually supposed to be sentenced to death by firing squad. He was brought out, like hood over, sent to his knees. They were getting ready to pull the trigger, and they stopped it like literally at the last minute and like cleared his sentence. But one of his quotes is that people do not really want freedom because freedom involves responsibility. And most people are frightened by responsibility. They prefer to live under someone else's idea of truth, to obey rather to think, to blame rather than act. The real battle is not between good and evil, but between cowardice and courage, between those who dare to think for themselves and those who choose comfort of chains. Now, that's my way of setting up this safety third, who we know is popularized from the television host, narrator, and thought leader Mike Rowe. And he did it in an effort to bring light to the ridiculousness of virtual signaling of safety culture. Yeah, and everybody wants their people to go home unscathed, but there are certain industries and professions that are simply not built for that kind of promise. Fire department being one of them. If safety is truly the most important thing in your industry or even on the fire ground, then nothing of any noteworthy importance is going to occur. In fact, downright terrible things can happen. And it may not, yes, it could happen to us, but it may be the civilians in the community that we're there to serve. So then, according to Mike Rowe, safety is not first. What it typically is money. In any industry, it all comes down to money. Everything always does. In the fire service, that means chiefs and politicians. They have people to answer to. Employees need to get paid. Apparatus needs to keep rolling. Supplies can't run out. It's also based on community trust, so we have to save life and property. Departments are also going to do what they can to keep workers on the floor, reduce overtime liability, cut down on workman's comp cases, not kill anybody in the line of duty, and to be very matter of factly about it, that's an expensive thing to a fire department. So then safety is not first, and oftentimes it can't be. Now, Mike Rowe goes on to say that who should care more about safety than us, though? Going back to Dovstesky's quote, it comes down to us. And we can print everyone goes home on our t-shirts, and we can take all the certification programs. We can placate every policy on the fireground, but at the end of the day, it's going to be the responsibility of the individual and not even necessarily the organization. It's up to us to be quote unquote safe. So I took this from the Operational Excellence Society and what they thought their primary tenets of safety third was. If one is money and all the other policies that placate an organization. So safety, obviously we talked about being a personal responsibility. It's the worker, not just the employer. We're responsible for ourselves. Complacency is a massive danger. So according to philosophy, the endless repetition of safety first, it actually can become background noise, and it causes workers to stop thinking critically about potential hazards. So by placing safety in a different context, the message becomes more engaging. So that can be messages and real examples that we can get out while on the training ground. Now, context and risk assessment for this are crucial. So we place safety at the top of this rigid, unchanging list of priorities, but that can be unrealistic. When we're on scene of emergencies, we need to have this thoughtful risk assessment, and that's where we weigh safety against the other essential priorities, like accomplishing the mission, working with minimal information from ambiguous messaging, and leaning into the fight in these high-risk environments. And then I like how they broke this down. They say a safe workplace is an outcome, it's not a goal. So rather than that being the primary objective, safety is just a byproduct of well-managed systems where the employees, or in our case, the firefighters, you're engaged, you're competent, you're empowered to make good decisions, because a highly competent workforce is going to be naturally more attuned to safety protocols. And for us, it's not even necessarily the safety protocols. You're doing the things to efficiently accomplish the tasks on the fire ground. And that, in essence, makes you safer because there's higher quality in what you're doing. And then there's also some balance and empowerment that we need to give our individuals, which we kind of already touched on. By placing safety in a balanced hierarchy of values, it's often behind mission and productivity and creativity. We can encourage proactive and innovative risk management. So this is going to empower employees to be vigilant participants in the safety rather than just be a rule follower. And I think that's a major component to risk aversion, is that we just have rule followers and we lean back on that. We can't rock back in our heels instead of leaning into the fight and being vigilant and being proactive on these calls. So again, there's this complacency versus competency. Competency requires discipline. It requires experience. And I'm not talking about that 20 years experience or I've got 15 years experience. I'm talking about expertise. What does your skills say that you can do? We've talked about this before, your physical prowess, how you're actually capable physically on the fire ground, your tactical acumen, how skillful you are, how you're able to regulate your emotions. And when you combine all these things, then we can lean into the fight. And I tell my crews, in no uncertain terms, I fully intend to put you in harm's way. I'm not going to do anything that somebody else that I would respect wouldn't do. I'm not going to ask you anything that I personally wouldn't do. Oftentimes, I'm going to try to be right there alongside of you doing those things, as long as I'm not in some like command position. But I fully intend to put you in harm's way because that's where change is going to be affected, right? When also, I know I don't, like everybody says there's no second 911, but there's that group 30 seconds out that says no one is coming, it's up to us, right? Sometimes people on the fire ground, I watch them like, oh, I have SCBA issues, or hey, I'm going to go take care of water supply. Like, no, you're on the first in engine. Like, you need to advance the hose line and do rescue. You know, it's the thought of how can we get around doing this, or maybe who else can do it. We need to shift the mindset to there is no one else that is coming. It is up to us, and we need to be default aggressive, and that's when good things are going to happen, right? Leadership under fire. They had a really great report. They had a white paper where they talked about human performance factors in line of duty deaths, and they broke it down into 5 main human performance factors of operational stress: the fallibility of human memory, what happens before the alarm, qualitative firefighter data, and then there's outcome bias. So to expand on this, these are just some lines taken directly from their report. So operational stress, they want to identify sources of psychophysiological stress or the environmental elements that adversely impact the cognitive function of decision makers being subjected to heightened or extreme pressure. That's so much of what I talk about with the in extremis readiness stuff, is the emotional state, the physical state, the amplifying effect between the two, and then how your physical capabilities and your skillful tactical acumen and your emotional regulation all meet up to be able to handle the stresses that we see on the fireground. There's the fallibility of human memory. So it's this episodic memory following events where individuals were subjected to heightened levels of emotional stress, and that can make you fallible. The practice of interviewing members a week or 2 or later after a catastrophic fire increases the likelihood of memory distortion and contamination. So there is so often, and there's a ton of research on how we basically misremember things. And this can happen while we're in these actual in extremis events. So we take past experiences, we try to overlay them. Oftentimes it works really well for us with whatever problem we're dealing with, but sometimes we keep trying to force the same thing in light of new information, and that's not going to treat us well. So we need to learn to be able to zoom out, reevaluate, and pivot. There's also this element of before the alarm. It's not just your years of service and training and education. There's so much more to it because we are humans in human organizations. It's relationships, it's prior calls, it's your expertise and experience, it's the organizational climate, the culture, the morale, cohesion among crews, who's detailed in that day, who's detailed out that day, do we have acting officers? All these elements that happen before the alarm play massively into how the alarm is actually going to be run. There's qualitative firefighter data, which I also hammer on a ton. It's the performance narratives and the causality. They fail to distinguish between experience, insufficient training, a uniquely complex predicament. For example, they say a qualitative and quantitative assessment of members' prior experience at similar fires and similar occupancies would offer important context. So basically, how do you operate on calls leading up to this point? There's increased transparency about experience levels, training regimen, and human factor data points, and that can strengthen the performance causality and yield a more nuanced risk profile narrative. So we try to just take a blanket paintbrush stroke with a lot of our firefighters of, all right, well, here's their training certifications and experience, or like years on the job basically, but it's so much more than that, right? Every firefighter is different. Sometimes we have the same person that shows up differently each shift, and that all plays into how we're going to operate on these calls. Like, it is a very nuanced thing. And then there's outcome bias, and a lot of these reports for near misses and line of duties and maydays, we don't highlight the burdensome unknowns that plague decision making, strategy adoption, tactical actions. And many of these reports fail to detail a singular unknown, or they connect decisions and or actions to assumptions, and the reports later prove that something that they thought was happening is actually false. And then we also get to look back on things with clearer eyes, and then we start admonishing people for the actions they made when in the moment there's no way they would have been able to discern all the factors that were coming in and make a good decision. Now, why is this? There's a really cool report called Decision Making During High Risk Events, a systematic literature review, and that was from Carrie Real and her team. And this study examined how trained professionals make naturalistic decisions while under pressure. And basically the takeaway was professionals must adapt to the time available. There's types of uncertainty and the individual skills when making decisions in high-risk situations. And basically, if I could just sum this entire research down, is the greater time you have, the better quality decision you have to make. And your decision-making quality goes up. The less time you have, that decision-making quality goes down, obviously. And this is due to things like time pressure. We have very limited time to make these decisions, take in all the information, act on it. The stress, obviously, physical, mental, emotional stress, the uncertainty, trying to make meaning of ambiguous stimuli. And then you can still be plagued by errors, whether it's personal, other crews, you having to adapt and make up and gain ground lost from other crews' decisions or even yours. So time pressure, stress, uncertainty, and errors all play into this decision-making quality. The less time you have, the more that decision-making quality goes down. But that still means that it doesn't negate our responsibility to make these good decisions. We still need to lean into the fight. So to sum all this up, being safe sounds nice, but it's not always grounded in reality, not if you want to do anything particularly special. So this first part, I just hammered a ton on safety culture, what safety is, where it came from, how it's built and developed. But I want to be very clear that there are decisions that we're going to have to make in these extremist environments, in these high stress, high risk environments. And we have to do the best that we can. And I believe that it's because of all these factors I talked about that splits out between who leans into the fight, and those are the people that go find things on the fire ground that are not essential, and they basically are able to hide, or they hide behind policy. So I just threw a ton of different arms of my thoughts, opinions, research, white paper stuff, definitions, examples of things that have happened in the community, just to kind of provoke some thought, right? In the next episodes, we're going to be talking about risk aversion. So why do people lean back when they should be leaning into the fight? I'm going to break this down into cultural, behavioral, and physiological reasons of why I think this is happening. And then in the last episode, it's going to be to develop grit. Like, how do we develop a mindset that will allow us to lean into these really hard decisions and hopefully accomplish some really great things? So a lot to unpack here. I know I'm going in a ton of different directions, but I appreciate the support, and hopefully you'll be hanging out for later episodes. And yeah, thank you. Check out the Patreon. I'll have more links and resources up there. Maybe make a little bit of this make sense. And we'll see you in later episodes. Thank you all.